Good afternoon, everyone, or should I say good morning, depending on where you all may be in the core world. Glad to have you all with us, and thank you for joining the Core Network's latest webinar. I'm Marie Walker, the Chief Operating Officer here at the Core Network, and glad that you all are here with us today. The topic for today's webinar is owning your narrative. And we are excited and pleased to have Dr. Elizabeth Santiago from the Untold Narratives joining us today. And I have the honor of introducing her in just a few moments. As a quick reminder, I want to remind you that, as always, you can find information about the Core Network's webinar and other events under the Events tab at corenetwork.org. We also share about our upcoming webinars on social media and in the Crew Leader, our newsletter for the course staff. Few housekeeping notes as a few reminders. Please make sure that you're on mute. We invite you to drop your questions in the chat as we go, and we'll get to them a little bit later during the call. Captions are turned on. In your Zoom window, you should see an option in the lower toolbar to turn on captions. You might need to click on those three dots to enable that. This session will also be recorded and posted on our website by tomorrow morning. You can find it at corenetwork.org. If you go to the Events tab, click Webinars, and find the event. Please stick around at the end of today's session. You know, I always like to say that there'll be a test, but it's not really a test. We'll share with you a few important updates and reminders, and there'll also be a quick survey that will pop up at the end of the session when you click off. And we appreciate your input because that's how we know what to offer and what topics you guys want to talk about. Back to today's topic. As I mentioned, our topic for today is owning your narrative, and presented by Untold Narratives, an organization that focuses on storytelling that honors all realities and histories. Personal stories are so important to the work that we do in the core world. A narrative is a collection of stories. Narratives are central to our daily lives and how we process the world around us. You might ask yourself, does our core have a narrative about core members we serve? Are the communities that we work in? When a story is told thoughtfully and responsibly, it can tell us not only the details about someone's life, it can help us truly understand that person. Narratives can bring us together, but they can also be harmful. They can perpetuate misinformation and dangerous beliefs. With the help of Dr. Elizabeth Santiago, we're going to explore what it means to share your story on your terms. We'll discuss what it looks like to share stories about our core members and the people that we serve in the way that maintains their integrity. When you leave today's session, we hope for three things. Number one, that you have a better understanding of how narratives affect you on a daily basis. Two, that you will also leave with tools for interrogating narratives and thinking more deeply about the narratives you believe. And three, we hope you walk away with actionable ways to ensure that the stories your cores share are authentic and honor the whole person. Now, a little bit about our presenter today. Dr. Elizabeth Santiago has been a storyteller for almost as long as she's been alive. She has read a lot. She read a lot as a child and was struck by the stories that weren't being told. Stories about her ancestors, about her community, about her neighborhood. She earned a bachelor's degree in creative writing from Emerson College and then a master's in education from Harvard University. She taught writing and adult literacy courses for many years before deciding to pursue her PhD in creative writing for literacy, acquisition, and liberation. She is the author of The Moonlit Vine, an acclaimed young adult novel featuring a 14-year-old young woman who must rise within her own strength to bring peace and justice to her family and her community. The novel was published by Lee and Low and has gotten star reviews. She is also the founder of the Untold Narratives, which includes a website to support all the writers in finding and sharing their stories not typically told due to marginalization. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Santiago. Liz?
Thank you. Thank you, Marie, for that welcome. As you were reading about narratives or talking about narratives, I was sitting here going, yep, that's right. That's right. I wanted to snap and clap. So thank you for that. That was an amazing introduction. I appreciate it. So I'm going to share my screen and get us started. Okay, so 1 second. I think I'm sharing the wrong thing. 1 second. I'm going to try that again. All right, I think this will do it. Yes. Okay, perfect. So I was going to start with a little bit of an introduction, but Marie really did a wonderful job. So I'm not going to share any more about myself at this time. I'll talk a little bit more about my storytelling journey and some of the ways storytelling has changed my life. I did want to share a moment or share a note here about a podcast that I had done a couple years ago or a few years ago called Owning Your Narrative. And I'll share links later if you're interested in digging a little deeper into the topic. I wanted to give you a couple more resources, but definitely wanted to share that podcast that we did. But I'll get right into things. So for today, our agenda is I'm going to share some community agreements, which I'm sure you are all familiar with. I have my own, and I want to share them before we get started. I'm going to do a warm up, and it involves a little bit of storytelling. I'm going to talk narrative. I'm going to expand upon a lot of the things that Marie has said at the beginning. I'm going to talk about how storytelling connects to narrative change. We're going to do a lot of practice with some personal stories, and then I'm going to share with you some tips and tricks for telling your story and cultivating the stories of others as you ask folks to share their personal stories or share stories in any way. And so I just warn you to be prepared to write. As we get into the community agreements, you don't actually have to share what you write, but I would love for you to take a few moments to write in response to some of the prompts that I have for you. Okay, so here are our community agreements. I believe strongly in taking space, especially as a storyteller, as a writer, as someone who has chosen a more introverted profession. I tend to hold back, watch, observe, and that's fine if that's who you are. But take space. You're here. Ask questions, participate, challenge, whatever it is that you need to do to take that space. I want you to do that. But then I also want you to give space. So if you're somebody who's very extroverted, who's used to talking in these kinds of environments, maybe just hang back if you notice you're one of the few people talking. So take space, give space. All of our stories tell a complete narrative. So I believe that each one of us has a part to play in building a complete narrative. So I definitely encourage you to not only write your stories or share them, but also just think about the ways storytelling affects your life and can enhance other things that you do. Speak and write your truth always. There's no right or wrong answer to any of the prompts that I give you. This is your truth. Speak and write your truth. And again, here we go. Share your reflections on your terms. I would never force anyone to share their writing or even, unveil their thoughts. So do that in ways that you feel comfortable. And then finally, do what you need to do to participate. If you need to step away for a minute, do that. So I want you to be comfortable. Okay, so those are the community agreements I have, and I'm going to move us on to a warm-up. So these are three quotes that I use a lot. I love, and I wanted to start us off with these quotes. And what I want you to do is, as I read them, I want you to choose one that resonates with you, and we're just going to write whatever comes to mind about that quote for 3 minutes. That's it, 3 minutes. So let me read them to you. You can start thinking about it. The first one is by Toni Morrison. She says, it's a very short piece of what she says, but here it is. Make up a story. Narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. So that's our first quote. Second one is from Tommy Orange, who wrote the book There. Great book. He wrote in the book, all these stories that we have, oops, misspelling, all these stories that we haven't been telling all this time, that we haven't been listening to, are just part of what we need to heal. And then the last one is from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who did a very famous TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story. And her quote is, "The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story." So I want you to think about one of these quotes, whichever one resonates, and you're going to write whatever comes to mind for 3 minutes. And I would love it if after anyone would share a little bit about what they thought in relation to these quotes, and if comfortable, what they wrote. So I'm going to put 3 minutes on the clock and we're going to write. Okay, so I would love if you would just finish your last sentence, your last word, wherever you happen to be. And I would love to hear what quote you connected with. You can put that in the chat, or if you can get off mute and want to share, that's great. I'd love to hear from you. I saw something in the chat, but now I don't see the chat anymore. Here we go. So I'm looking at the chat. It says the second quote by Tommy Orange immediately had me thinking about Indigenous people and peoples. They just need to move on. They just, yeah. Uh, yeah, thank you for sharing this. And I think that's important. And for those of you who are not familiar with There or Tommy Orange, he is a Native American writer. And the book is just beautiful. And so I do highly recommend it. But I couldn't agree more with what you're saying, and I appreciate, or what you wrote, and I appreciate you sharing that. Um, any other folks who want to just share which quote resonated? Again, you can get off the chat or sorry, put it in the chat or get off and mute and share. Well, if no one has anything to share, I will move on. But this is again just a warm up to get us started, and you'll have more opportunities to share, trust me. Okay, so let's just talk about what is a narrative. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, Crystal, I just saw what you put in the chat, so forgive me for moving on. Yeah, the TED Talk, the Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie TED Talk is very famous and I think one of the most viewed on TED. And you're right, it's very important to get a broader perspective. Sometimes we don't take the time to do that, and we rely on limited narratives. So thank you for sharing that. Excuse me. So what is a narrative exactly, right? So it's a collection of stories, in its broadest sense, but it's a collection of stories that together convey a common worldview, and it affects our culture and the way we view things, because these narratives sometimes are overarching ideas of a culture, of a people, of personal beliefs. And so every single narrative has that context. And I think that's an important piece to understand as we talk about narrative. It's that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. They are born out of our cultural beliefs, our societal beliefs. And since our identities are so complex, no one narrative is going to capture, similar to the Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie quote, like no one story can capture that that story or that narrative. Even when we try to lump folks in, I think just for convenience sake, or just for the sake of being able to talk about a people. But if we say something like, in my case, if we say something like Latinos or Latine, that is such a large group. There's no one way to look at us as a culture, as a people. And so, but it's hard when we have these limited narratives around us about certain groups. Again, when this PowerPoint, hopefully it gets shared with you, I put a bunch of links and resources. If you want to dig deeper, there's a lot of references here. But that's a narrative. There are then these dominant narratives that prevail, that prevail in our society and in our culture. Some of these can be, at best, they inform us, they help us make sense of some things. At worst, they blame people who have been typically oppressed or marginalized by systemic forces for their circumstance. And that makes things challenging when we think about these dominant narratives, which is why we kind of think about them as this invisible hand that guides our society, that guides our reality or our perceived reality. And it's a little creepy when you think about that. Like as a writer, as a storyteller, I want to now write a story about this invisible hand, and what that means for us as a culture. But so these dominant narratives exist, and sometimes they're fine and harmless, and sometimes they are actually not great. An example of this, I think, is one that we know in American culture we hear a lot, is that if you work hard enough, you will succeed. Also known as the, pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. Now, I know we've debunked this, we've talked about this, or there's been a lot of discussion about this particular narrative being false, but it's a good one to unpack or to use as an example, because it does speak to our American culture as being sort of individualistic, and you kind of make what you can out of your life. It's up to you to succeed. There are no societal forces that are, keeping you from succeeding. It's all based on you. And we believe that for a long time. And I can say personally, that kind of thinking has been harmful for me, when I realize in reflecting on my own story, how that narrative kept me from my community, or kept me from connecting to my community in a certain way, because there was this sort of individualistic or separatist worldview that comes with this idea of you succeed by the amount of work you put into something. I'm curious at this point what you think about this particular dominant narrative, or any um, thoughts about dominant narratives in general at this. And again, get off mute or put your thoughts in the chat. So I know this is a common narrative, and I know that there's been a lot of discussion as of late, trying to or move us away from this thinking, but it is definitely a good one to think about. Pulling yourself up by your bootstrap isn't always exactly when certain people aren't even given boots, right? So we're not, if we don't start off with an equal playing field, then we aren't able uh, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, to work hard enough to get what we need, whatever success looks like for us. And so there's such a false narrative here, and I think it's one that's important to debunk. So yes. When I think about narrative change, I think about it as shifting this kind of definitional power or narrative power, in putting it in the hands of folks who have been not heard, who have been underheard, and giving them a platform and giving them a way to add to the dominant narratives, to add to the various narratives that inform us as a people, so that we have a fuller picture. So we have that fuller picture that we need to create a complete story. And so narrative change supports that kind of thinking. And one of the ways in which narrative change is supported is through this idea of counter narratives, which is what I was alluding to. And counter narratives in and of itself implies that folks who have historically excluded from the dominant narratives get a chance to share their own narratives. And this is a term that has been coined in association with critical race theory, and a lot of research around that, and how having these alternate point of views, or a more authentic representation of society, of a people, of a culture, helps create that fuller picture and that nuanced reality. And so counter narratives are important. And so how do we build those counter narratives? Well, counter narratives start with you. Counter narratives and storytelling, or narrative change, starts with you. It starts with storytelling, and starts with adding to what we already know about a specific narrative or situation. So I, as a storyteller, I have to share a story, and I want to share the story about the book that I wrote and why I wrote it. And I think it's an interesting one about a dominant narrative that has been since proven false. And so the narrative I grew up with as a Puerto Rican woman was that, well, my culture, my ancestry is made up of Native people, or Taino people, African, and European. And I believe that, of course, throughout my whole life, and it's true. But I knew very little about the native people of Puerto Rico, and that was um, by design, right? The narrative out there was that uh, the Taino people were extinct. Just didn't exist. And but that ran counter to what I was told growing up. My mother insisted that we were native. She had lots of stories from her mother, her grandmother, her great grandmother, who were all grew up on the island and lived on the island of Puerto Rico, and they had a completely different understanding. When I went to Puerto Rico, people there had a completely different understanding of what this idea, this narrative that the Taino were extinct. And I pondered and reflected on that for many years. I did a lot of research. I even went to Spain to figure out what they might know about this. And that was a disappointment, unfortunately. And I won't get into that, but that was a disappointment. And I learned a lot more from talking to people on the island where they had more insight into the ancestry. So what was interesting is that in 2000, I think it was 16, because of the proliferation of DNA and like with sites like ancestry.com and 23andMe, they discovered that many people from Caribbean islands still had Taino DNA or native DNA. They created a whole category of this DNA category for Puerto Ricans specifically because Puerto Ricans had a significant amount of Taino DNA, which went counter to the dominant narrative that the Taino were extinct. And so that put me on a path. I did more research. I looked at books that were out there, and there were actually no books written about this history in the way that I saw, in the way that I wanted to talk about this particular history. Um, and so there are books out there. There's a lot of archaeological books. There's a lot of historical pieces. There's one novel about the Taino people written, by a Puerto Rican person. But at any rate, I wrote a young adult novel that features the Taino and their connection to American culture, to Puerto Rican culture, in the Caribbean culture in the present day. And it was a challenging book to write because I was writing back and forth in time. I started in 1492 when the native people of Puerto Rico encountered Christopher Columbus, and that kicked off a lot of their troubles, let's put it that way. So it was important to document this narrative, or to document a counter to the dominant narrative that the Taino were extinct. And I took a picture when I was in Puerto Rico of some of the petroglyphs that still exist from the Taino, and you see that picture here. So again, writing these narratives and building these counter narratives are important. When I'm out on the road talking about this story, the amount of people that come up to me and say, wow, I really want to learn more about this. I knew nothing about this. It warms my heart because I know that now they're going to be on a road of discovery like I was. And maybe there'll be more stories about the native people of not just Puerto Rico, but the Taino were the native people of Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. So they make up a lot of our history. And so I was honored to write about them. So with that in mind, I have another activity for you I want you to think about. And I want you to think about narratives that you are dealing with. And this is just a thought exercise. Again, there are no right or wrong answers, but what are some of the dominant narratives that you've accepted? And maybe like sort of in the same vein, I sort of accepted that the Taino didn't exist anymore. But now I know that that's not true. So in that vein, what are some of the dominant narratives that you had accepted and that you're trying to let go of? Or what experiences have you had that go counter to a dominant narrative? So I would love to just spend 4 minutes, so one more minute than the last one, having you think about these questions and jot some thoughts down. And again, if you're open to sharing, I would love to hear from you. All right, so 4 minutes.
Can I take this time to share, or should I just wait till after the writing time?
Why don't I would love for you to share, but let's wait a couple more minutes so other folks can finish their writing, and then we'll have you go first.
Yeah.
You have about 30 seconds. Okay, so you can finish your last sentence, word. And the person who asked to share, if you wouldn't mind sharing at this point, that would be fantastic.
Hello. So
Hi.
my name is Giovanni. I'm with AmeriCorps, and I'm a Civic Spark out in WRCOG for the as an Iron Fellow. One of the narratives that I had accepted that I'm trying to let go of is, I think everyone who has like a college graduate like felt like that post graduation depression per se.
Yeah.
I think it's just like it's crazy because you kind of get raised into the narrative that you go to college, you get the degree, you'll get the opportunities, but then I think it's the timing aspect that I'm trying to let go of, as far as, you do go to college to get an education, which is nice. Like, you should definitely have learned something that you
Yeah.
cared about or that you were passionate about. But it's also important to like get those networks. And then
Mhm.
that's, I feel like, as equally as important, that whenever I have kids or have someone that I feel like they should go to college, it's literally the putting yourself out there. And because you don't know who's going to give you a job opportunity, or you don't know who's going to give you a reference or really try to point you in a different way. So I guess the whole going to college and then everything will work out immediately after is
Yeah.
what I'm trying to let go of, like the immediate um, reward.
Yeah, Giovanni, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's interesting because what you're speaking to a little bit too is sometimes narratives are out there and they're incomplete, right? So there are also so many things that people don't tell you when you graduate college, that things that you have to do or that would be in your best interest to do. And so it requires a lot more work and networking and all of that that you mentioned. And it's not as easy as it seems, like on paper, right? You graduate and then all these great things happen. And I wish that was more transparent. And then I see Beck in the chat. I'm just reading what you wrote in the chat, so give me a minute. Ah, okay. Yeah, it's so, yeah, I love that. I love that because that speaks to the also why I use that as a community agreement. I'm glad you brought up this idea of taking space because yeah, many of us are taught to not do that. And that held me back. Sometimes even though I still tend to be a little bit more quiet in, especially when I'm participating in something. When I do talk, I always feel like, oh, am I taking up too much space? And the reality is you aren't. And I'm glad that you learned that that narrative, internal narrative, right? Because we have these internal narratives as well that are often false. That you learn that. Any other thoughts on this? Does anyone want to um, get off mute and share or share in the chat? Well, thank you to those who have shared so far. Again, I don't ever force sharing of stories or personal experiences, but I'm glad that we're here and this is the space that we're in. And so many of you are taking advantage of that. I do want to share my own story, a little bit of my story so that so we're on equal playing ground, right? Like, so not I'm not making you share and then I'm not sharing. So I shared a little bit, of course, about why I wrote The Moonlit Vine, and that's a little bit different. But recently I was asked to write or reflect on this idea of how storytelling connects to belonging, or connects to this idea of equity. And this is where I want to move us for the remaining time that we have. It's in this conversation about how our personal and our professional lives connect and how storytelling can help support that. So that those connections. So for me, I've spent a lot of years and time, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to own my own narrative, because I would consider myself more untraditional or non-traditional student because I dropped out of high school, or I left high school when I was 16 and earned a GED when I was probably 17 or 18, and then went right to work. And it took me maybe 12 years to get my undergrad and graduate degree. And then of course another 8 years to get a PhD. But I, sort of came from a community of very strong women who were some of the most outgoing, intelligent, hardworking, problem-solving people I have ever met. Like, these women killed it, just were doing everything that they could. But they, we just didn't have a lot of money. So when they would go out in the world, I would sometimes accompany them to doctor's appointments, things like that, these same fun-loving, wonderful women would clam up. They just stopped speaking. And I didn't understand at first why that was happening. And then as I moved through the world, I realized that the narratives were hurting us in some ways. There weren't a lot of people like us out there who were trying to help us. There weren't the people who were trying to help us didn't necessarily have the same lived experiences. So they were coming at us in ways that silenced us. And I could see that happening to, again, these women that raised me. And it was at first just I didn't quite know how to make sense of it. And then as I moved through my career in my college life, I also started to clam up because I was feeling this sense of not belonging. And I realize later in life, as I am owning my own story, owning my own narrative, that a lot of that really affected the way that I showed up in certain spaces. And the ways in which then when I became a leader, I was in the nonprofit world for 30 years and left my last role where I was the chief program officer of a national nonprofit. I built a team, my team of 13 wonderful people, and I made sure that we felt that we all belonged with each other, and that was important to me. And I realized in reflecting on my personal experiences and my professional experiences, how they were intertwined, and how the things I did or experienced as a child, as a teenager, deeply impacted how I moved through life. And so I wrote a blog post about it, and I will share the link if you all want to read it. I'm not going to get into more detail about it, but I did want to explore why a community of people felt or acted a certain way in one setting and didn't act that way in another. And it's that sense of belonging that happens or doesn't happen. And so um, that's one of the reflections that I've had about how the personal and the professional are interconnected for me. And I wonder again, like I'm going to do this really quickly, probably just a couple minutes. Well, actually, you know what? I'll give you a couple minutes to respond to this just to get your thoughts together. And if anyone would like to share um, some of their personal and professional experiences, please do. If not, that's really okay. But I do want to give you a moment to also think about why you do the work you do, what drives you in your career, and how your personal experiences drive your professional life. Very similar to the way that I described. I ended up working with folks who had also disengaged from high school. I was a teacher for many years, and then I was an adult literacy instructor, working mostly with women who didn't feel like they had a voice. And so we told stories, and I said, you all have that. And I'm giving you a platform to do that, to share your stories. And that again formed the basis of the untold narratives as well. But that just really shaped who I am and what I do for a living. So I just want you to take a couple minutes to reflect on that. Again, you can share if you'd like at the end or not. Again, this is much more of a personal question. So I'll give you that time and then we can move on from here. All right, so finish your last thought on this. And I'll just, if you have, if you'd like to share, please do, either in the chat or getting off mute. If you would like to share, excuse me, even just what made you think about, what this prompt made you think about, or if you want to share anything else related to this, I'd love to hear. Okay, I see something in the chat, so let's take a look. Beck. I'm reading, so sorry if yeah. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Beck. I mean, many of our foundational or personal life experiences do support or affect the choices we make later and what we want to do. And that is such a great starting point, so that if you are in the process or would like to share your own story, this is one great exercise to think about how to do that. Again, I write because I want to and I need to. It's one of the ways in which I share my voice. But it's not always the way I share my voice, I should say, the way I process things. And it's not always for others to view. It could be just for yourself. And it's just helpful to have a little bit of an understanding of who you are and where you are and how that fits into the larger picture. So just an activity I'll leave you with for something, in case you want to do more with this going forward. And so I'm going to share a few tips as you think about sharing your story or writing your story or even talking about your story. Here are some things that I think are important for you to know around owning your narrative, and things that I follow in my own storytelling. If you're uncomfortable sharing, don't do it. Period. It may seem obvious, but sometimes it's not so obvious. I just remember when I was a lot younger, because I worked for an organization that supported young people who had disengaged from high school. I was often used as sort of the poster child, right? Like, share your story, get on stage, do this. And there was no consideration or discussion for how I might be affected by that. And now I know that that's just, it did more harm than good. And so at this point, if I get that twinge, like, yeah, this is not a place for me to share my story, I'm not going to do it. And if you do decide you want to share your story, however it's shared, make sure you understand how it's going to be used, so that it doesn't show up somewhere you didn't expect it to. It's super important. I teach creative writing classes, and I always tell students, I will never use your writing for anything without your permission. I will always be transparent if I would like to use something as a good example of, here's a good example of an opening. I always ask permission. I always make sure any writer knows or any storyteller knows how their story is being used. And again, don't be afraid to set limits on your story. Like it's your story. You don't have to do, you don't have to do it in a way that is prescribed to you. Again, write your truth. Don't try to fit into an external agenda. I have seen situations in my career as a nonprofit person where folks will ask a young person to share their story, and then when they get the story, they want them to edit certain things that don't feel flattering or whatever it may be, and that's just that's not the point. Let people write their truth and be open to sharing that truth. And again, retain ownership of the story. Do not give it away, and ask to be paid. Storytelling is work. So if you are sharing your story, and ask for compensation. And the same in the reverse side, when you are gathering stories from whether it's young people or from other people or constituents, whoever, participants, here's some best practices for gathering those stories. So you invest in relationships. Don't just cold ask people to share their personal life, and some things may be harder to share without having a relationship with someone. So invest in those relationships and build on them. Also consider how the ask is being framed or presented. It shouldn't just be assumed that this whoever you're asking is going to share their story without any questions. So definitely consider how you're asking. And again, prioritize transparency throughout the entire process. So whoever's writing the story knows exactly what's going on. And that goes with ensuring storytellers own and control their stories. And back to speaking truth and writing truth. So you position storytellers as experts. They know they're the best to speak on their experience. If that's why you've asked them to write a story, let them tell their story and don't second guess it. And it's also important to acknowledge your position and power. Um, Back in the story that I shared when I was asked to be sort of the poster child for certain things, I often said yes because I didn't feel like I could say no, especially when it was asked by a boss or someone in authority. And so if you are a person who has a lot of authority or, in the position of power, again, going back to consider how the ask is being framed, just acknowledge your power uh, and ensure that the person telling the story is doing so because they want to. All right, and make all the stories accessible to communities. And then, of course, again, compensate people for their stories. I wanted to leave you with some other activities and tips for tapping into your story. And so this is something that you could take away again if you get, hopefully you'll get this PowerPoint and you can look back on this. So if you are working with somebody who is telling their story or you want to tell your story, here are some exercises or ways to do that. And so these are sort of fun things that I do. Write about a time when you faced make a list of your top 5 fears. I mean, I could write probably 20, but your top 5, and then write about a time you faced that fear. That could be a nice essay or, just a nice writing activity. If you are wanting to delve into fiction, you could write about a character who's forced to confront one of your fears. Like, I think that would be a lot of fun. And then there are a couple other examples of some ideas to get you into the storytelling mode. And here are a couple other prompts that I want to share with you. So creating a character who's the opposite of you is always fun because you learn a lot about yourself if you have to describe the opposite of yourself. That's a nice one. And then again, for a nonfiction piece, what's most important to you in life? What do you value most? Those are just really good ways to get into writing. And then here's just something about craft, a quick thing about writing from the senses. It's super helpful. I do this as a novelist. I go back into my writing and I describe what it feels like, what it sounds like, what it smells like, and it really adds depth to your writing. So if you're writing something and you're looking to add a little bit more color or depth, this might be something to try to make that your writing come to life. And the last thing I'll share, again, I know it's a lot, but I wanted to give you a lot of resources. These are prompts that I use a lot in workshops and in ways to warm up people to writing a story. So a lot of these are fun, like or personal. Write about a story that needs to be told. I often think about those women that I grew up with who would tell some of the most colorful and funny stories, but then they would just be for that party or that time we had coffee together. So there may be stories that I want to tell because I think they're great. or, a historical fact or person that changed your understanding of the world, or a time you felt like you didn't belong. So anyway, these are all just examples of things that you could use to get writing. So I'm going to stop there because we're very close to the end, but we have a couple minutes. If you have any questions, thoughts, considerations, anything you want to share as we wrap up, I would love to open it up to y'all. And if there are no questions, I just wanted to share one last thing, which is if you go to the Untold Narratives, we're having a showcase on December 12th from 6 to 8. And we would love to have you come. It's just a virtual showcase of our Black and Brown girls who are our fellows. We run a fellowship and love that we're having a showcase. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. I'm seeing the chat. So thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Santiago. This has been enlightening. It's been a great session. I think for myself, the one thing that I took away from this was when you were talking about making your list. I think my biggest one was tap into real feelings.
Mm,
I think oftentimes when I think about writing, I'm trying to make up stuff
yeah.
and make myself feel something, whether it's there or not there. But you said tap into real feelings. So
Yeah.
I'm going to remember that one. But I appreciate, thank you so very much
Thank
for
you.
sharing with us today. It's been inspiring and enlightening. And on behalf of all of us here at the Core Network, we appreciate you and appreciate the work that you do and for helping us with conversation with cores, how we can talk and write about each other. A couple of quick reminders. There will be links in the chat for more information. I think Emma's put that there. But just a few reminders for you. Don't forget that when you do log off, there will be a survey. If you'll take just a couple of minutes to fill out that survey to give us some much needed feedback. Want to remind you of a few things coming up for the Core Network members. The annual profile is due by Friday, November the 22nd. All cores are required to complete the profile, and your data is important and essential to us at the Core Network to help to advocate and support your programs. So please remember, if you have not, as a core organizational core member, turn in that core profile by Friday. On this Sunday, November the 24th, it is the opening of the winter application cycle for the Patricia Sagawa Core Member Relief Fund. Boy, that's a mouthful to have to say. The Sagawa Fund currently provides payments of up to $500 to young people facing financial challenges during their service term in their core. The application window for this cycle will close on December 1st. Also, keep an eye out for the early registration for CoreCon 25, which is the Core Network's 2025 National Conference. It will open in December, and we hope that you will come and join us at the conference, which is happening March 11th through the 13th in Arlington, Virginia. We have a new location this year, so we're going to be across the river in Arlington. With all that being said, another huge thank you to Dr. Elizabeth Santiago for taking the time to be with us today. And to all of you, don't know if we'll see each other again, but happy Thanksgiving to you all. Be safe out there. And please, please, please check our website for information. It'll be there. And a recording of this session will be available for you all in the morning. With all that being said, have a great week, rest of your week, a great weekend, and a great Thanksgiving. And peace.